Thanks, Jeff. That was great. It's always interesting to hear your perspective on things. And so we actually had a question come in from Twitter while you were speaking. So the question from Andrew Campling is, with regards to the current and future state of the internet, is it suffering from ever more focus on optimization of web apps at the expense of everything else?
Hi, Andrew. It is web apps rather than everything else. Well, in some ways, I suppose, we managed to create a security infrastructure out there, a set of ever narrowing apertures where the only thing that makes it through these paranoid devices is TCP port 443. And this is really sad. This is really sad because in some ways, if that's the only thing that gets through the aperture, that's where we all crowd.
Right.
Now, if we hadn't been so stupid in developing paranoid security systems that just did damage and actually tried to understand the problem we were really trying to solve, we wouldn't be in this mess. But these days, if I want a protocol that works, even the DNS, and I don't use port 443, then I'm in a really sad place. And so what we actually find is there's a bit of UDP and a bit of TCP and everything else gets dropped. We found with the V6 transition, we wanted to use a new protocol number 41, IPv6 and IPv4, disaster. Why? Firewalls. We tried all kinds of tunneling mechanisms, disaster. Why? Firewalls. And so in some ways, everything is a web app because that's the only thing that gets let through. It's not because web apps are good. It's probably crud. It's probably really bad. But if that's the only way to make it through, pragmatism says, that's what I'm going to use. Everything else gets layered above that. And so, yes, Andrew, sadly, even the DNS is now a web app.
Yeah, I guess I shouldn't ask for your opinion on DNS over HTTP.
You just got it.
Okay. That's great. We'll let you know if more questions come in. We have some of our speakers on as well. And so we're going to come and bring some folks on. We have, let's see, Archana, you have a question for speaker?
For Marcel. Marcel, are you on? Hey. So the question that came for you is, are there situations where no matter the configuration you try, some users are impacted in favor of others? The follow on to that is, how do you determine the configuration to go with and what is it based on?
Yeah, so this definitely does happen, right? And you know, at the end of the day, it's kind of an unavoidable reality, right? Some users just, there's no configuration that creates good performance for them. And at the end of the day, this is ultimately perhaps a large scale architecture decision that maybe is a little outside of my purview. But it's ultimately not really any different than other sort of growth decisions, right? If you're trying to decide where to put a new point of presence, you're actually going to have to make the same types of decisions, right? About which users are most important to being served. You know, a lot of times it's focused on decisions like where can we have the biggest impact across the most users, right? Which networks can we help the most? Sometimes it's about there are certain networks that we otherwise have poor coverage for, so it makes sense to sort of baby them along a little bit. So it's very case by case dependent. I would say there's maybe not there's not sort of uniform policy that we can apply, but I would liken it very much to general sort of expansion planning.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Marcel. Angelique, the next question I think is for Jim and David.
Yeah, so the question for Jim was referring back to your comments on VPN and local peering. So what do you recommend for enterprises that are looking to fix these performance issues for workers that are working from home? How do they go about working with service providers, for example, to address some of these performance issues?
Sure. So I'd recommend that the enterprise, first of all, do a survey of their employees and find out what are they using at home? What are the providers that they have at home where they're doing their work? And then armed with that information, they can decide which provider or providers is the majority of their user base, and then talk with that provider. Unfortunately, a lot of providers have historically had the attitude, particularly if they're smaller telcos, that the way to fix this problem is you buy a connection from them for your enterprise, and now your problem is fixed. But it's only fixed for you. It isn't fixed for everybody else. So that's generally the answer that most of the suppliers want. But obviously, having discussions with them, particularly if you have some economic incentives to offer in terms of doing business with them, and try to convince them to do more peering publicly. But certainly, if you absolutely have to fix the problem for your enterprise, buy a connection from that other provider.
Good advice.
David, question for you. You've been tracking disruptions, internet outages for a long time now, right? And so what is it that you've noticed or something that's changed, stayed the same with, from the perspective of lockdowns?
Sure. Yeah. And it's an interesting question. It's something I've been actually thinking about for the last couple of months as well. I think that we've seen internet disruptions due to network issues, fiber cuts, cable cuts, things like that. Those have more or less continued apace. I think you're always going to have errant anchors and configuration issues and things like that. I think what we've seen a decline in over the last couple of months have been the large-scale government-directed shutdowns. The 2-week shutdown in Ethiopia that just kind of ended, notwithstanding. But I had been talking to some colleagues about that as well, and there was this question of is that decline because governments are finally realizing just how critical the internet is for everybody's lives now, thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the lockdowns. But I think what we ultimately realized is that it's less that, unfortunately, and more that a lot of the events that historically drove the shutdowns, the riots, the elections, the things like that, those have been not taking place, or they've been postponed, or the elections have been postponed, the riots haven't been taking place, depending where you are, of course. But those sorts of activities, I think, are happening with lower frequency right now, which is then driving the governments has been driving fewer government-directed large-scale internet shutdowns. And I'll use this as an opportunity also to plug my blog, internetdisruption.report, and work that we're doing at the Internet Society as well on the Measuring the Internet project, looking at internet shutdowns.
Thank you, David.
We have a follow-on question for Jeff, if he's still on.
I certainly am.
Andrew has a follow-up question to your response. So he has said, if everything morphs into web apps, how do you see this impacting open standards, security, and ultimately privacy? He's pessimistic, he said.
Oh, I think it's perfectly reasonable to be incredibly pessimistic about the internet. Indeed, trying to search for something that hasn't quite got this sort of ring of acute pessimism is at times quite challenging. The early days when we thought this opened up broad horizon of digital communication, where any protocol was possible, any form of interaction was possible, where we discovered and were playing with all kinds of methods of communication, sort of vaporized at some point because we abused that environment so horribly that everyone put up filters and firewalls. And this response to this level of abuse is actually almost worse than the problem it was trying to counter. That we are locking this down now and creating intermediaries, creating a brokered communication environment, all in the name of enhanced security. But of course, the fundamental observation is, if we're relying on security being prime number factorization, the first quantum computer that works will blow that out of the water. If we're relying on security being a bunch of CAs that never ever lie except when they lie, then again, this whole stuff is terrible. So I can share Andrew's pessimism that we're building a very encased internet, and trying to think that the little bit of greenery we've managed to fence around is greenery worth living in. The problem is it's probably not. And the issue is, I think, in some ways, what we don't do is look further afield. We don't measure, we don't observe, we don't feedback. We are constantly just reacting and very little understanding. And I think part of it is that we kind of lost the research and academic community somewhere down the path of commercialization. And somewhere along this, we kind of assumed, well, this is all done. This is all fine. Thank you, boffins. You can go home now. We understand this so well. We're just going to exploit it for what it's worth. But I think that feedback loop of understanding what's going wrong in exploitation is missing. And creating ever more draconian firewalls and shutting the apertures down ever more highly and creating systems where the poor operators, as we saw at the moment, are pulling what's left of their hair out trying to balance traffic. This shouldn't be happening. If we can make self-driving cars, why can't we make self-driving networks? What is wrong with us and why we managed to get it so thoroughly wrong is actually a really, really good question. We don't understand what's happening. We don't watch closely, problem A. But B, we actually don't think about what we've just seen and put it into context and understand where to go from here. And so the result is, as Andrew observes, we lose privacy, we actually lose flexibility, we lose a whole bunch of things that in the long term are valuable. And so, yes, this is not the ideal place to be. I'm sorry, it's just not. And trying to understand how to make it better is, I think, the challenge for all of us. And I would encourage folk, the researchers are not dumb. The researchers are actually part and parcel of an ecosystem that hauls us back out of this mess. So thank you, Andrew. Good point.
Well, maybe that's not too pessimistic. So we have a open question to anyone on any one of our speakers who would like to comment, and this is, about the segmenting and closing off of the internet with actions by Russia or things like new IP under the Chinese government. If any of our speakers want to comment on that. So the question is about, how effectively the internet is kind of fragmenting or, kind of becoming different internets, if you will, given Russia, given China. And there was some specific reference to new IP under the Chinese government, which I think you've written about, Jeff.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yeah.
I actually think new IP is a throwback to the 1990s. What is being, I suppose, proposed inside this model is back to a model of dumb applications, dumb hosts, and clever network. It's the whole QoS thing all over again. The internet is a scarce resource. Applications don't know how to make use of it. The network itself will arbitrate, manage, and massage traffic and actually control the applications. Now, if you're a vendor of network equipment, everything I've said is wonderful. Because all of a sudden, you're the center of the spending. You are the gatekeeper. You're the toll box. You're the reason why routers cost millions of dollars. The thing is, no one else believes you. And no matter which learned committee of greybeards you go to in the ITU, the answer is the internet is a marketplace. And what fuels the internet is my money and your money. It's how we behave. And if we want Chrome to do wonderful things, if we want our browsers to leap over tall buildings, if we want a different network, our money makes it. And so in some ways, I think the Chinese stuff is really just regressive, badly thought through, focused on all the wrong things. We've been there, done that, and moved on. And quite frankly, is doomed for failure in exactly the same way that OSI was doomed for failure. It's the wrong approach. We've lived that life. We're moving on.
Cool. Okay. So another question that's come in, this one maybe, I don't know if you can answer this, Jana. So this is around how CDN use has changed for customers. Has there been anything in the wake of shutdown in terms of like maybe what they're caching on CDNs, how they're using it to better optimize traffic delivery? Have you seen anything like that?
So off the top of my mind, I don't know if anyone's changed their config significantly. I mean, I certainly haven't heard of any patterns of changes happening across the board. But one thing for certain is that customers who are seeing surges are relying more on our CDN and also on facilities like shielding. So we offer this 2-tier thing where you can put a shield node in front of your origin server so that across multiple POPs, requests get collapsed on their way coming to your origin server. And again, those are all just ways of scaling your service across the world. And that's, I think that broadly speaking, customers who've seen surges definitely rely more on our services. But I don't know that there's any pattern as such.
So
changes in configs.
Right. But maybe using more of the security features or using it to, as you said, shield their origins, maybe using like hierarchical approach to the CDN deployment. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, sure. Yeah, that too. That's certainly in part of the shielding that we offer. But I think, broadly speaking, again, it's reliance on facilities and on organizations that allow you to scale. Fastly is one of them, and that's the sort of thing that we see.
Cool. And did we have any questions come in, Archana, or did you?
No, I'm just looking at. No, I think we're done with all the questions. I don't see any new ones pop up just as yet.
Yeah, I think we've had some comments come in, which are interesting. So yeah, I mean, this was really interesting. The kinds of questions that have been posed, a lot of them have to do with, the sort of the kind of the fragmentation of the internet is one thing in terms of where we're going, and then we had the questions about how everything seems to be kind of funneling into like this kind of very web app focus, even something like DNS. So kind of interesting to see where everybody's going in terms of what their concerns are.
Yeah, totally. I was just kind of, as taking a look at these questions, thinking back on some of the sessions and some of the highlights. One thing that Jeff mentioned on the ECN piece sounded really like RPKI in the BGP world. Like, until everybody does it, there's really no purpose of doing it. So I thought that was
well, it's like the same thing with DNSSEC, which it's
exactly.
like, unless it's adopted widely, then it's not, it doesn't work.
It doesn't serve its purpose. Yeah, totally. And then Roger's session talking about not underestimating planning and like planning ahead when there is no pandemic or there isn't anything coming crashing down or burning is something that I think we can take across, like use it as an advice across all segments, right? Not just about internet or building networks. So that was interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, despite the little disruption that we had initially, it seems like we are back on track. And it was really great to hear from everybody. Luckily, it was smooth sailing after that.
Yeah.
But if anybody has any questions that are follow-ons, feel free to drop us a note either on Twitter, we're at Thousand Eyes, or you can drop a note to the show that's internetreport@thousandeyes.com, and don't forget to subscribe.
Yep.
This was really great to have so many folks come from the content delivery side and from the research side and share what they've seen and how they've addressed performance issues and content delivery issues. So
right.
And
I'm hoping that, over time, kind of, to the point we were making earlier, Angelique, is like enterprises providers, like other than the NOGs, kind of creating that forum where you could exchange ideas and have these kind of vendor agnostic discussions. I mean, that's really the point of when hosting a show like this. So I think over time, I'm looking forward to that evolving and kind of creating this community where, we can come together. All right. With that, if you have, again, any more questions, feel free to send that in. We'll get in touch with the speakers and, get their perspective on it as well. And then if we can just throw up the last couple of slides in there before we, take off. Just a reminder that we are again on the podcast every week. You're going to see us again next Monday. We have some interesting outages and events to cover, an outage that happened earlier this week. So we're going to talk about, I think, was it WhatsApp? I believe it was WhatsApp.
It was WhatsApp, yeah.
It was WhatsApp, yeah. WhatsApp went down. We saw something that we could talk about. And again, if you have any interesting guests, or if you want to be a guest on the podcast as well, definitely reach out to us. Then Angelique, onto the report that's released.
Yeah, that's right. So just, we previewed some of our findings earlier, and we're going to be releasing in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned, and we'll provide more information on where you can download that report. So check it out.
All right. Thank you. And thanks for being a part of the show. We'll see you all in our podcast.
Thanks for joining, everyone.